give a little introduction. She is going to be giving her presentation on power dynamics and interpersonal goals and how they predict mental imagery perspective. Stephanie is a second-year PhD student working primarily with utilities, and also she's a Spencer, and she's interested in how subjective perspectives influence the self, goals, power, and how these extend to interpersonal and intrapersonal processes. So everybody, welcome Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, great. Thank you. So my name's Stephanie. I use she, her pronouns. And today I'll be talking to you about power dynamics and interpersonal goals and how those predict the mental imagery perspective that people experience. So first, I'd like you to think of a difficult or challenging event that you faced in your life. Maybe transitioning online or back to in person during the pandemic, and then pretend you will have to share this with someone else. So as you're thinking about this, you may have had some images pop up in your mind of this experience. And so that's what we're interested in, if in this communication context, if people spontaneously experiences images. And so one setting in which people share stories about their lives and difficult things is when they have an identity that's been marginalized in the past. So for example, in the Trevor Project, they had stories from queer youth about their experience in the community. And at the Well Black Project, they have stories from Black people and their lived experiences. And when sharing these stories, people might experience power dynamics based on their identity, their own identity, and the identity that they're sharing someone with. So for example, a queer person talking to a non-queer person might experience some power dynamics in that situation. And so when experiencing these power dynamics and across identities, people might see themselves through their own perspective, but they might also see themselves through another person's perspective. So in The Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Du Bois, there's this idea of double consciousness where Black people experience their own perspective, but then also they view themselves through the dominant white culture. Additionally, in objectification theory, when there's these power dynamics between men and women recall a time of objectification by men, they tend to take an observer's perspective. And so this is something we can actually study in the lab. So we study spontaneous mental visual imagery perspective. And so there can be first or third imagery perspective. First is when you experience things through your own eyes and how you originally saw the situation, whereas third person imagery perspective is seeing yourself and the situation around you. And so we're interested in predicting when people take first over third person imagery. And so why do we care about the imagery in people's minds? Why is this important? Imagery is actually a link between the situation and thought. And work in our lab that's emerging from Lei, perspective of storytellers impacts the communication outcomes for audience. So the type of support people receive and the different information that they gather from the story. So we're interested in how features of the social situation impact the spontaneous imagery perspective that people take. And now this is in the initial stages. This is actually a novel question. So we weren't sure at the beginning of this project if this does indeed occur. So we're in a more general context here, and then we're interested in moving into more specific contexts in race and gender and sexuality. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're interested in social power, and this is defined as having control over your own and others' valued resources. And in this situation, it's relative power. So you versus the other person in the situation. Additionally, I'm interested in interpersonal goals, so self-image goals, which are defending and gaining things for the self, and also compassionate goals, which is concern for well-being of others. So why these variables? Well, when telling stories, you may want to tailor them and choose to include other standpoints or not. And power dynamics are one way you might do this. And power dynamics do perpetuate inequity and injustice. And low power people might need to make their stories relevant for people with higher power in order to get the resources that they need. Additionally, people with self-image goals care about what others think, and people with compassionate goals care about others understanding their communication. So back to that challenge that I had you think about at the beginning. Do you think the power dynamics and your interpersonal goals might matter? Probably. And so the audience impacts the manifestation of these goals. Who you're talking to matters. And so our hypotheses were that people with lower power versus high power would have more third-person imagery perspective and more pure self-image goals. So that's high self-image goals and low compassionate goals would have more third-person imagery perspective. So that's an observer's perspective. And then same with pure compassionate goals. People with more higher compassionate goals and low self-image goals would have a more third-person imagery perspective. So I did 2 studies on this topic, and I'll be presenting them to you in an integrative data analysis. So I'll just present the methods to you in parallel. So first, we asked participants to identify a specific challenge or difficult event, just like I had you do at the beginning. And this was before the audience manipulation. So the audience manipulation was not a factor of the event people chose. Next, we manipulated the audience. So people either thought about their friend going through a challenging time versus a potential employer, or an incoming student versus a future professor, which were the high and low power kind of conditions. And then they wrote about this event to the audience that we manipulated. Finally, they completed measures of spontaneous imagery perspective, self-image and compassionate goals, and power. And so the audience manipulation was intended to create some variability in these items. So we pooled the studies in an integrative data analysis. And one of the first things we looked at was, did people picture this event? Because there's been some question in an interpersonal context, in this communication setting, are people spontaneously picturing things? And about 90% of people did. So overwhelmingly, yes. Some people don't experience imagery. And then the distribution of this perspective is over here. So although most people are using first person, which is on this 6-point scale, it's mostly first person or all first person to all third person. So 1, 2, and 3 would be more first person. Although most people are experiencing first person imagery, a lot of people still do spontaneously experience third person imagery. And so then we were interested in the effects of power and how power predicted the imagery that people experienced. And so we found a marginally significant effect such that people who experience more power experience more first person imagery. So that was in line with our hypothesis that, conversely, less power, more third person imagery. Next, we were interested in how the goals predicted the imagery that people experienced in their minds while thinking about this event. And we found a significant interaction such that if you look here, people with more pure goals, so people who had high self-image goals and low compassionate goals had more third-person imagery, and people with low self-image goals and high compassionate goals also had more third-person imagery. And so then we were interested in, how does power and goals play together? Because the power you have might impact the goals you're able to have. And so we looked at this 3-way interaction, and it was significant. And we found that in high power, this effect that we saw before was kind of dramatized. But in low power, that effect goes away. So it looks like power might be sort of this primary concern before people factor goals into their imagery. So answering some questions from the beginning. So features of social situation do in fact impact the mental imagery perspective that people spontaneously take. And power seems to be a primary concern, and then goals factor in. And this is important because we've seen downstream implications for communication, what the audience themselves see and learn out of stories based on the perspective that we've manipulated. And it might be particularly crucial for people with identities where power matters. So especially when sharing stories like I showed at the beginning, where there might be an identity imbalance and a power imbalance. And so in future work, we plan to expand into social identity threat. I have some studies starting up with Steve that will be looking at this in a physiological context too. And so we want to study this in the context of race, gender, and sexuality. And finally, we're interested in the mechanism and function identification of perspective. So how the perspective that people use is a functional piece of communication. Thank you. Yeah, this is my great lab and my cohort. So thanks to them for all the support. Any questions? Yes.
Is there a time other than high power where you think that you'd expect a lot of first person perspective? Cause you talked about like when you're hiding like depending on your audience, like it's likely gonna be third person if you want to be like perceived a certain way or if you care about like the compassion. But do you think there's another case where it might be high first person other than just high power?
Yeah, so I think in the context of like identities and stuff, perhaps if like people have like a shared identity in a conversation, so not necessarily high power or low power, but sort of like equal. So for example, like two queer people talking together, maybe there's more first person imagery because I know that you know what I'm talking about and we can have this conversation. There's more like common knowledge or my experiences. I don't need to have such an expansive view. Maybe we'll see. Yeah. Yes.
So this is what I was looking for to within person between situation variability, but I'm curious whether you think there's significance between person variability in versus third person views and what implications that might have for kind of personal characteristics or just
Yeah.
personality and those sorts.
So you're asking if some people use more first, yeah.
So some people just use more first person versus third person, and what might be the like individual like person level factors.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some work looking at social anxiety. And when people who have high social anxiety present, they tend to remember the experience from a third person perspective more. So I think factors like that would definitely increase third person imagery. Also, in all of these models, we use memory age as a covariate. So in the situation, if people are more likely to, like maybe older people are thinking about the past more and more, those images would be more from third person than first person. Trying to think of some other situations. I think in like people, so in more emotionally driven contexts, people are more likely to use first person imagery. So perhaps if someone is higher on like emotional scales, like personality differences. Yes.
Has this kind of topic been studied with like language analysis, whether like I versus like you, like speaking more generally, you know, when you experience this, like is that a connected like body of research?
Yeah, so narrative voice is distinct from imagery perspective. That's actually something we're working on separating out right now when we ask participants and when we manipulate perspective to measure, but I'm also working on a machine learning algorithm to take all of these stories that I've had people write and see if we can pick out what those verbal differences are in language. So working on that project now too. So that'll be cool if we can see what verbal differences people have. Was that my time? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Lottie.